1962 in the order, and I'm waiting, and I'm looking one eye on the train station times of when I'm going to go to Utrecht, and in the other eye, I'm looking at all these people getting their burgers, right, and their fries, and the numbers are going past. So we're going 1975, 1998, 2000. It's just going up and up and up. And so I'm basically faced at some point in time, because everyone else is getting their burgers and my burger is not coming through, with this existential crisis, right? Do I wait and stay for the burger, or do I leave and take the train and give up on this? And why do I tell you this story? Because I kind of feel the same sort of way with the field of migration studies, right? In that I think we have been waiting for this field to deliver that burger for people who are interested in decolonization, people who are interested in race, people who are interested in discrimination, to deliver that burger for the last 30 to 40 years. And now we've got this decision to make. Do we stick around and wait for this institution now to reform itself, to transform itself, to deliver on the promise of migration studies? Or do we walk out the door and do we find something else? Do we try to reconceive this study, this field in an entirely different way, on different terms? And what is the possibilities for doing that sort of work? So that's the basis of my talk today, the general feeling which I come to speak to you today. I think someone else has got their mic on. Now, I come today as well as not a card-carrying holder of decolonial thought, right? I haven't read my Latin American scholars. I have this old sort of, fascination with Dipesh Chakrabarti and the post-colonial thinkers of old, but that's a long time ago. I have some sort of resonances and sympathies for the literature, right? All my work is based in the Global South. I kind of have a problem with geopolitical forms of oppression, and I'm interested in the topic of race. But that's about it. So I'm not coming as a real decolonial thinker, but I have sympathies for the agenda, and I think there are important things that migration studies has to learn from this literature. And what I'm going to do today is, first of all, unpack some of the ways in which I think coloniality is embedded in this field. I'm going to talk about the state of play at present, where this field is at the moment and what might be done. And then I'm going to give you the negative side, the walk away, take your train to Utrecht side, and the stay and wait for your burger side. Okay, so let's start. And this should hopefully, can everyone see my screen? I hope so. Can you see the screen or the PowerPoint? Can do it separate. Have I just left?
Oh no.
I'm coming back.
Are you able to share this?
I'm trying to. There it is.
That's fine.
Okay. Can you see my screen? I've clicked on it a couple of times. Unless we go through, if you share from there, it's just not clicking. Why don't you share there,
Yes.
if you can, and I'll keep talking.
Yes.
And I'll just come over there. There's so many technological workarounds. Good. Work? Oh, there we go. Is that me here? Oh, that's you there presenting. And then you just go into present mode and then we'll be fine. Great. So we can go to the next slide. So first of all, I want to talk about how coloniality is prefigured into the way in which migration studies understands history. And I want to do that by talking about the fact that for a long period of time, and I'm just still waiting for my slides to come up, but the history of migration and the history of migration governance have largely been seen in a very Eurocentric lens, right? The story of migration is told largely as a story of European peoples migrating from Europe originally to the New World, and then eventually of a return migration happening particularly in the 60s, 70s and 80s as the former colonized people returned to Europe. Now, we all know that this is a very limited story, that it conceals this grand history of migration. People were moving all the time in continents like Africa, Latin America, Asia. But nonetheless, we have this story of migration. Leslie Ann Mock does some fantastic work on it, but she is the one who begins the narrative. And then this becomes a narrative also about the governance of migration, right? The fact that immigration control has been largely, it was an invention of European states, designed by European states to control post-colonial migrations. And then this model of territorial control, detention centres, deportation practices has been then subsequently exported to countries elsewhere. This is a narrative that you can see sort of really outlined in the work of people like John Torpey, who does this fantastic work on the monopolization of legitimate movement. But actually, John is not really the one who creates this. Yeah.
Mic up or
my mic. I don't think so because I'm trying to keep the audio off, and
that means the room mic's trying to pick you up, and apparently the sound was quite poor for our
okay.
40 minutes.
Does that have a mic?
It does. There was a weird reverb where when I tried to use it, and also I don't know how comfortable I feel on using my mic.
I'm fine using a mic or anything just to get past these technical glitches. And I'm plugging into here. Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
It was pretty disconcerting when I tried it, but maybe that's kind of the viewpoint.
I can't use this as like into a Mac.
Can people still hear?
Do you want to? I mean, why don't I just present from here?
Yeah.
Use this camera.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How about that? Can you hear me now better now? Give a thumbs up or put yourself on screen and say thumbs up.
Yes, they can hear you better.
Okay, great. Okay, so where was I? And so there's this narrative as well about the history of migration control. Are the slides up?
No.
Okay. So let's share screen here. And is that? Now they're up. No? They're up there. Can people at home see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. We're moving. So I'm going to look at the slides and present from here. There'll be a little bit of finagling, but we'll go for it. So yeah, there's this embeddedness of the way in which this Eurocentric model, but the way in which we understand international migration and the way in which we understand international migration control. And I mean, a variety of works have been contesting this in a variety of ways, right? I think Adam McCown's Melancholy Order produces a notion of migration governance, which is largely centered on control of migration in the Pacific. Radhika Mongia does this work which suggests that actually the forms and the norms of international migration governance were not, first of all, produced by these sort of Cretian European states and then exported elsewhere, but they were produced in the context of the Indian Empire, in which the Raj, the nascent Indian state, was playing a major role in deciding the terms of migration, who could move where, and under what conditions. I've done some work as well with a bunch of colleagues, including Joel Quirk, who we co-edited this book called Mobility Makes States, which basically takes issue with this idea that we generally look at African states in terms of the way in which they fail to meet European standards of territoriality, unity, capacity, and immigration control. But in fact, if we look closely at the way in which slavery, segregation, internal movement controls have been managed on the continent, many African states are actually quite powerful in terms of controlling and managing mobility, and if we understand them on those terms, we can see them in line with this sort of Charles Tilley analogy, whereas war makes states in Europe, mobility makes states in Africa. Or at least that's how our story goes. But it's not just history where we find these resonances or these residues of colonial thinking. It's also in geography. So many of you would have seen a map like this before, right? This is a representation, because one of the ways in which we can look at migration is like getting all of those maps with big arrows which show where people are moving. But another way in which we can look at it is to try and to imagine what Eilert Schachter calls how the birthright lottery plays out, right? And the birthright lottery in Eilert's terms is this notion that when we're born, we are put in a very grand lottery, right? That where we are born is going to determine very many aspects of our lives. What sort of livelihoods we're going to have, what sort of future we're going to have, what sort of gender politics we grow up into. But in particular, it's going to control where we're going to be able to move and what countries are going to take us and what the power of our passport. And this map basically explores the varied power of passports, right? Visualizing the number of countries that people with a certain nationality can travel to without a visa or with a visa on arrival, right? And it shows a very we've seen these sorts of maps before, right? Where the states in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia in darker colors, darker hues, have relatively little power to move elsewhere, to move without visa controls. Whereas states like Australia, despite rarely ever accepting any reciprocal rights, we have one of the most powerful passports in the world. I am Australian, sorry about that. But this is another the way in which coloniality, I think, is embedded in the geography of the migration control system. It's racial, class. Despite race not playing a major feature in any immigration policy, it nonetheless is deeply grounded in the way in which immigration policy and immigration practice takes place in most countries throughout the world. It's not only that coloniality, I think, and colonial legacies are embedded in history and space, but they're also embedded in our epistemologies, right? It's very long term, which I use as a front for saying, how knowledge is constructed, how we create thinking and thought in the field of migration studies, how theory is developed, and where it's developed. And it should come as no surprise that in the field of migration studies, there's a very, very strong distribution of labour between places in the global north, Europe, North America, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and places that we usually associate with the global south, right? Here's a representation of the distribution of the global map. Here, this is a distribution of migration research output per capita, right? Most of it is produced. Sweden does it very, the Nordic states are doing very well. The UK, but Europe, South Africa to a certain extent. But there's a great disparity in terms of the process of knowledge production and who has the right to speak on behalf of migrants and about migration, right? And again, here I'm a guilty candidate, right, in the fact that despite having some sort of, a different hue of skin, having originated and most of my work having been based in a place like South Africa, the seduction of coming to the global north and working for one of these universities is often very, very strong, right? And these are where all the jobs are and where the knowledge practices, the forms of state thinking tend to begin to influence the way in which migration studies is produced, migration thinking, and our intellectual labour and how it is driven and the terms upon which it's made. It's not just in this geographic division of labour that we see these differentials. I think it's also come to impact upon very conceptual language that migration studies uses to talk about the phenomena that we're interested in. And so here I'd like to talk about the residues of colonial ontologies. Now, I don't know, there's probably a few migration, I saw Nick Mashinsky's out there, there's probably a bunch of migration scholars out there who know exactly what your average migration-related research funding call looks like. And the conceptual vocabulary that migration studies has to utilize in order to frame its objects of analysis. And we have, sorry, I can't, there's all sorts of screens and things and people, hello, I'm still here over there, I'm talking with you. we have come to use a very statist ontology or set of concepts in the way in which we represent and talk about our subjects, the subjects that interest us, about migration and migration control. Forgetting which. Here's an image that of the assisted voluntary returns program run by the IOM, and there's a father, we think, grasping and clutching his child and kissing him or her, and this is an image of what many might think is a fantastic process, of family reunification. But what they're really talking about here is deportation, right? Deportation, pure and simple. And it's a term that we used to use in migration studies, right? That we used to be the way in which we talked about how people who didn't want to return to their countries of origin were more or less often forcibly sent back home. But it's surprisingly, this language of return is not only featuring on IOM pamphlets, it's featuring in the pages of the most prominent journals of migration studies at the moment as the way in which we now talk about deportation, right? The term that we utilize to talk about this very violent, forcible act. And I have deep problems with that because I like deportation. It has resonances to the Holocaust that I think are extremely valuable politically in the way in which we think about and conceptualize what is going on in this act of forced removal, what is going on in this highly racialized form of migration management and control. And I'm disappointed with my colleagues for having dropped deportation as a term, and I tell them about this very regularly. But there are big problems with when you try to move against this system. So one would think, because most migration study people, as scholars, are really good people, right? They actually see themselves as pro-migration, as someone who is doing research on behalf of migrants, or in a way that is supposed to produce more migrant-friendly outcomes. But it's interesting to see how wedded we become to the terms that we love, like the ontologies that become a core part of our discipline or our subfields. And a good example here, I just tweeted about this the other day, was Willem Schinkel's article in which he took a go at integration studies, right? So integration is supposedly the study of the way in which communities are able to better get along and deal with their differences, broadly speaking. But largely, it's a study of how migrants are able to convert, translate, and become a part of their receiving societies. And Willem basically makes this point in this article, right? And says, maybe we should drop this term. Maybe it is too wedded to the status project of trying to transform migrants into non-problematic subjects. And he took a lot of fire for it, because not necessarily because people want to support the state's integration project, but because people were wedded to the conceptual language that he was objecting to. And I think this is a problem with immigration studies, because I think, in my opinion, we need a fundamentally reframed and rethought ontology, and we need to become less wedded to some of the status objects of analysis that we've come to take as our own. Just side note, Stefan Schiel and Martina Tazzioli are coming out with a piece which asks that we basically drop the term migrant, or rethink how we define the term migrant, to come up with a term that is far more represents the fact that the only migrants that we really study are the ones that are politically problematic, right? And they are asking us to rethink that conceptual ontology in a really interesting way. Watch this space for that article to drop sometime next year. Okay. So where does that leave us? Because I've told some pretty nasty stories about my field and of its colonial residues and legacies. So where does that leave us at present? Where is migration studies right now? Well, the going is good in migration studies right now. Here's a depiction produced by the NCCR project, a really good project in Switzerland, where they're trying to map migration studies institutes around the world, and they come up with a count of 218 institutes with your usual sorts of concentrations in the northeastern sector of the United States and a lot of it in Europe, less so in other parts of the world. But 218 migration research institutes, just start to do some of the math behind that, right? Like if we just think about one position, now many of these institutes have 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 positions, one academic position on a permanent basis over a number of years. We're not talking about, small money here. We're talking about the hundreds of millions of euros, dollars, whatever is your denomination. I mean, Thomas Gammeltoft Hansen and Nina Sorensen have this concept of the migration industry, which largely looks at all of the different actors who play a role in controlling and facilitating migration. This is a big part of the industry, right? That we are a huge sector within, although the knowledge-producing component of that, we are a huge and growing part of the migration field, of this migration industry. And that's a lot of resources going in those directions. Let's look at another metric. We're also producing a lot. Like, we're not just sitting on our hands here. This is a graph. Also, I think this is produced by, it's in an Oxford publication. I forget the authors, but you can find the link in the slides, which I'm happy to share. But this is a graph which depicts the gradual growth of the field, of the amount of literature devoted to these topics. And we can now document like up to 45 journals which are largely focused on migration or migration and related diversity, so ethnic studies. I don't think religious studies fits in here, but journals which address the topic of migration as their main focus, 45 journals. That's a lot of production going on constantly. Sorry, as you can see in the tagline, I've just contributed another one. We've just launched Migration Politics, which is a journal which is open access, slow scholarship, and non-corporate. So hoping to buck some of the trends in migration production, but again, we are part of the problem. So there's a lot of literature out there, and this field not only continues to grow, but in a certain way it also becomes, and here I guess is the nub for people who don't do migration studies research, who might be in the audience, that the field is colonial in relationship to adjacent fields, right? That migration studies is not just happy with studying migration, but I think it's moving into an intellectually colonial mode. And how do I say that? Because I come from the discipline or the sub-discipline of international relations. And I don't know what you guys know, but any of you know a colonial discipline, international relations, we are the best at. Well, I mean, we're pretty good at it. Because in the 80s and 90s, international relations just started swallowing up a whole bunch of related and adjacent subfields. And I like to do this in a way, and this is how, I mean, I'm an editor of an international relations journal, and as well as a migration studies journal. And this is, so for those of you who are in adjacent fields and want to know, is my field colonial? This is how you detect it, right? This, when you get an abstract that looks like this, right? And basically it goes like, the study of international relations is very important. In adjacent subfield or discipline, the study of X is very important. Yes, the subdiscipline of international relations is yet to fully understand the impact of X on international politics. Therefore, in this study, I will conduct research to better understand the relationship between international relations and X. And nothing else, right? Like, that is enough to get you published in an IR journal, because this is how this discipline works. It's constantly out there discovering new things. Like IR the other day discovered ethnography, right? And thought, we must bring this thing back into IR so we can better understand international politics. I'm being facetious. There is value to these exercises, but often this is enough to sell it. And this is what migration studies is doing at the moment, right? I cannot tell you the number of articles, presentations that I've seen where it is sufficient to say, this has not been done in migration studies, therefore we need to do it, right? And this is a problem because I think there are other intellectual pursuits outside of migration studies that don't need to be in migration studies, that need to have their own funding, that need to have their own focus and intellectual support that are not about the study and the funding of migration. Now, why am I so upset about this? So it's funded my, my intellectual career for a long time, and the journal that I work for and the institute that I support. Why am I so concerned about this ongoing and continued growth of the field of migration studies? Well, I think brass tacks, with all of this money, with all of these resources, what have we achieved? In the period in which I diagnosed from 1990 to 2020, things have only got worse and worse for international migrants. And most importantly, the most basic findings of my international migration research are not being taken up and utilized in the policy circles that we had envisaged would finally and one day take rational, science-based approaches to international migration. Take, for example, Hinderhaas. Poor Hinderhaas. I really like Hinderhaas. But he has been preaching this basic mantra of, and his work is really good on this. It's this basic logic. So there's this understanding of the relationship between migration and development, right? And Hein argues that, if a country starts from a very low level, many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a low level of economic development, and it begins to develop, then it's going to produce more migration, not less migration, right? Because why? People have the money to migrate. Very simplified version of the story. And they're going to use that for migration projects to move to other places. It's very simple logic. Eventually, they hit this sort of bump in the development road, and then they find that they have a lot of internal resources, levels of development at home. Things start to change and move around. But basically, it means, this whole logic that the European Union loves, like, let's spend more money on development and Africans will stop migrating to Europe. It's entirely flawed. The absolute premise of it is completely flawed. Hein goes along to these conferences all the time and preaches this mantra, and people nod their heads, and they do the exact same thing in the next policy. The European Union Trust Fund for Africa, suddenly Europe managed to put together €500 million to spend on, after the migration crisis, on migration in Africa. And what were they focusing on? Development projects, reskilling, investment in small businesses, in the idea that this would somehow stem migration to Europe. It doesn't work. They're not listening. This is not their agenda. And there are structures and political processes in action which relatively put political processes outside of the game of all of the input that we're having as migration researchers, the knowledge that we're producing, the inputs that we're having and trying to generate. So if we think that by producing better science and better migration research, we're going to have the sort of political impacts, that we're going to suddenly stop deaths in the Mediterranean, that we're going to prevent Europe from becoming a colonial actor through its externalization of borders, I think we need to rethink that idea. We need to either come up with some greater humility or think more about the field of migration studies and its future and what it can do for us. So I've given you the logic now for heading to Utrecht. Now I'm just going to give you the logic for staying and having that burger. Sorry, there was if you're just plugging in now, you will not get the analogy, you will not get the story, but roll with me on it. What is the potential for transformation of this field in a positive way? And I'm going to give you 3 nice stories to go away with and go, yes, it's okay, we can still go to a MISCO this year. First story. I believe...
Darshan.
Yep. Yes. I will mute this one. Some decolonial reforms. I believe in science. I'm still a social scientist in some way. Even though I hang out with anthropologists, I think that representativity matters to a lot of social scientists, right? That at base level, the one thing that you can try to convince, and I think migration studies does involve the humanities, but I see it anyway, if you go along to places like MISCO, if you look at most migration institutes, it's sociologists, geographers, political scientists, anthropologists, and some lawyers. And I believe that these researchers do think about representativity, that they want to understand the world in general, right? And so in order to do that, you can't just focus all of your research on the US-Mexico border and the Mediterranean, right? You can't just, you need to diversify, to think about theory, to think about your objective analysis in a slightly different way. And why do I think this is possible? Well, I think conflict studies did this. So this is, again, not very scientific, but I just took, before I came to this, this presentation, a snapshot of what I see as the leading journal in conflict studies and the leading journal in migration studies, Journal of Peace Research and International Migration Review. And sorry if the font's very small, but I'm just going to tell you what the story tells us. And then I just looked at what are the main single case studies that feature in the pages of both of these journals. And in Journal of Peace Research, it's African conflicts, Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, Native American conflict history, and if you go to International Migration Review, it's Germany, Norway, Germany again, just for good measure, Western Europe, right? With proviso, a special section on the Middle East, but it's all about why Middle Eastern migrants migrate to Europe, right? So why do we have this massive contrast? Because Journal of Peace Research used to be in Journal of Peace Research, you used to focus largely on great power politics, nuclear warfare, and whether we're going to see some sort of transformation in the theaters of the Cold War. And at a certain point in time, conflict studies became committed to a certain form of representativity. They started asking the question, where are people dying? Like, funny things for conflict studies to do, right? Where are people dying, and where are they dying in greatest numbers? And they went, well, it's mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Why aren't we studying those places more? How can we elevate the importance of these case studies, these sorts of places in our analysis? And I think for a long time, migration studies has wanted to do that. It's wanted to say, where are people moving? Right? And they don't come to Europe. They don't come to North America. People largely migrate between countries within the Global South or within countries in the Global South. And so most of the frameworks of migration governance and control are also to be found in those places. And I believe there are sort of moves to begin to change the orientation, or at least the geographic lens of the field in that way. Now, a lot of this research takes the form of migration still in its colonial mode. It's taking concepts grounded in the study of Europe and North America and trying to apply it to African and Asian contexts. But there are some, shining hopes of people who unfortunately don't get cited enough, but works like people like Kolani Shabalala, who wrote this fantastic work on hyenas of the Limpopo, where he looks at and I'm just using one example, there are many, where he looks at what he calls the Malaichas who move people across the South Africa-Zimbabwe border, and the sociality of those mobilities and the, what some people would call corrupt, but they are fundamental to the livelihoods of many sub-Saharan Africans and particularly people in this region, and tries to explain the sociology of that movement. Two provisos to Kalani's work, right? Now he's in Finland, as the book attests, right? So this gravitation from south to north is something that's difficult to avoid. And Kolani doesn't get any recognition for this work, right? He's never cited. I love Joris Schappendonk, I think he's based in Groningen, but he's seen as basically the expert on smuggling. But Golani's doing a lot of the same sorts of things in his work and just not getting the same sorts of credit. So, these structural obstacles to transforming how we think and relate to migration studies still are a problem and still need overcoming. How do we do that? Again, another relatively unnoticed piece. So I think there are ways of transforming the epistemological relationship between North and South in some important ways. And I showed you this graph before about the fact that there's this geographic, maldistribution in the way in which we produce knowledge about migration studies. But there are good examples of centres that have bucked this trend. The African Centre for Migration and Society in Johannesburg, it's a place that I used to work, has basically worked out a strategy of how to play the game of partnerships with European and North American organizations and funders. And that is to say that often Europeans and North Americans need you, meaning places in Johannesburg, in Rio de Janeiro, in Mumbai, more than you need them. Right? They need local partners because this has become a crucial element of most funding for research on places outside of Europe and North America for the last decade. The problem is, in many of these partnerships, it often ends up being the Global South research assistant working for the Global North. So Lauren, and he will admit, he's a white guy from Portland, Oregon, right? But he has written an amazing manifesto in 2012 in Journal of Refugee Studies. Please do check it out if you're out there, which basically gives you an 8-step program to how to play partnerships with northern-based funders. And I strongly encourage, it involves, in some elements, using guerrilla tactics, right? But privileging your own research agenda vis-a-vis your northern partners and forcing them to play that game on your behalf. Finally, I'll just end you up with one, final note, and that is like really thinking, so I've talked about some of the infrastructural reforms that we can think about, but how can we, fundamentally think the theoretical and conceptual agenda of migration studies? And in that, I'm just going to put up on the page my new hero, and this is Tendai Achume, and she writes an amazing book. I'll put the citation in the presentation at some point in time. But an amazing book. It's actually in Stanford Law Review, where she argues that we need to begin to see migration as a form of colonial reparations. Right? She said, let's forget about this whole open borders, cosmopolitanism versus communitarian discussion. Let's think about migration as a form of restitution, right? Of thinking about how we can both not only think about the fact that when we think of Western states and the way in which they have accumulated resources through colonial projects over the years as not having the right to insist on border control, to insist on their right to control sovereign borders, but also she sees migration as an individual act of resistance, of anti-colonial resistance. It's fantastic work. Again, I don't think the political theorists are too keen to cite Tendai, but it really reframes the way in which we think about the fundamental bases, the normative origins of our intellectual project. And I think the more that we listen to voices like this, the more we can, maybe get that burger eventually from my migration studies. So, I have left it open. I'm obviously financially very committed to migration studies, and I think we all are at many levels. Our careers are vested in it. We have ridden this wave for a very long time to our own value. But I think some fundamental rethinking of the intellectual premises of our project are in order. And I'm really keen to doing that with you all here and there today. Thanks way much for getting us through those early technical difficulties and for staying with us to the end. I'll take questions, I guess. That way.
I'm going to volunteer to moderate and try and do so with the audience in the room and online, unless Frank, you would like to do. No. Can the audience online hear me? Because I can't tell if you can hear me or not. Great. Okay, and how's the sound when I speak like this? Because I know there were reverb problems earlier. We can hear me loud and clear. Lovely. Very good. So, Darshan, thank you so much. If our friends online wouldn't mind, I think the simplest mode is to put your questions in the chat. And I have one to start off with, and I will voice them for you. And our friends in the room, just go for your life. And again, just thank you, Darshan. And that last point about migration as colonial reparations was a little bit mind-blowing for me. I have to say, it's the first time I've heard it said out loud, and it's sort of, wow. And actually, we have a question in the chat about that. Kathy, and I'm not sure where she's from, but Kathy would like to know the name of the scholar that you are citing there. So if you could say it loud and clear and possibly type it in the chat as well, that would be amazing.
Yeah, Tendai Achume, I will post it in the chat. She's based simultaneously at the ACMS at Wits University, and I think also at UCLA. And she's also a UN Special Rapporteur on what specific topic is, I forget, but I'm happy to put a link through so that you can access her work.
And I think her name was the only one that you didn't put in your PowerPoint, because actually Kathy was asking about the guerrilla tactics in donor relations.
Sure. So that's Lauren Landau, and he has a piece in Journal of Refugee Studies from 2012. I don't know the full title, but there's a symposium on it, which is quite useful because a lot of the people who he's partnered with, one of which is, I think, Stephen Castles, responds to Lauren and says, like, surely you're not suggesting that, actors in the global south should steal from the global north. And Lauren's saying, well, not really, but kind of, I don't, it's an interesting exchange in which Lauren makes the case that there's never been equality in these relationships, that there's always been this sort of language of partnership, but the people who are getting published and the people who are utilizing the resources eventually are not generally the colleagues in the global south. And so the logic of the argument is to give them a framework in which they can rebalance those deeply unequal power structures within the political economy. Yeah.
It reminds me actually of the role of translators for journalists, celebrity conflict pattern journalists, and of course there's an enormous amount of supporting labor done in the conflict zone by translators and fixers who do not get credited in the journalism. And actually it came up just the other day in knowledge production in terms of scientific botanical works. Who's actually going out into the environment and collecting plants and classifying them and bringing them back to the people whose names appear on the books. But this...
Just like while you're collecting that question, I mean, I think one of the, here's an easy tip for anyone who works at a global north university, and if you do work with a research assistant, and if they do have, many of them don't have scholarly aspirations, but many of them do, or could see that an academic publication as career building. I think a culture of intellectual generosity is really worth thinking about in terms of I can talk about when I was recently in Bangkok conducting research on the Thai migration regime. I had a research assistant who, I was rolling around to all of these policymakers and knocking on doors, and no one was giving me the time of day, right? And she came in and said, well, you've got to get some better paper, right? And get a good letterhead, right? And start to use gold embossing. No one's going to answer your emails. And she just radically opened the doors in a way that was largely accessed, right? This is not the intellectual project, but the project doesn't happen without her, right? And so, I think, the way in which we think about how we accredit our colleagues, that would be a step to think about those sorts of moves, which are quite simple. Particularly, we don't all need to be sole authors on everything we produce.
So I'm waiting for questions to appear in the chat, but are there questions in the room?
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for this. So I was thinking about what you said, when does migration become a problem? to be researched. And we can then look at, for example, Europe. Now, for the Europeans, migration is a problem when the migrants come from outside Europe. When there's migration within Europe, that's highly brave. That's what the whole European project was founded on. That is unlimited, unrestricted migration. Within Europe, anyone can move anywhere and work and live. And that is apparently a European value. And then all of a sudden, when that border is shifted just a few miles further south or east, then all that changes. Does this also happen in other regions where local migration is seen as good, but when you get too far, it is seen as bad?
I mean,
Darshan, can you restate the question?
oh, for sure. So the question is, in Europe, there was this switch to thinking about European migration as a positive thing, and extra European migration, or migration from outside of Europe, as a negative thing. And do we see similar transitions in terms of the way in which migration is viewed to, I guess, in regional organizations elsewhere? I don't know. Like, I've not worked in all regional organizations, but regional settings, but definitely not in, like, say, Southern Africa, where I did a lot of my work, right? I mean, migration from the US or from Australia or other places was deemed still, even in the post-apartheid era, as largely unproblematic, whereas migration from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Ethiopia, the Congo, black migration was viewed as deeply problematic by the government, the regime, and a lot of xenophobic township dwellers who saw them as competitors for livelihoods and their... So not necessarily, it doesn't always work on that regional logic, and that begs the question, like, how did Europe get where it is now, right? Like, and what's the racial project behind European integration? It's implicit in there, it's not always spelled out, but it's there, and we know it when we see it. Turkish whether Turkey becomes a member of the EU has always been the excellent question. But like a funny side anecdote, like, which maybe turns some of those power dynamics and conventional narratives on their head. Like, so this piece that I published in IPS, International Political Sociology, a couple of years ago, looks at the origins of migration, governance, and control, and contests this idea that Europeans invented everything. And one of the interesting side notes from studying the origins of European integration was this point at which the original 6 member states had to decide, where does Europe end? Because Europe in the 1960s was quite big. Like, it involved many colonial and post-colonial sort of environments, different levels of subjecthood and citizenship spread across those. And they had to decide, how do we define the outer parameters? Now, there was one narrative was, coming out largely of the Netherlands, was we don't want the formerly colonized peoples of the British and French empires to be freely able to migrate to the Netherlands. But the other side of it was a lot of the French resisting a more expansive understanding of European citizenship on the grounds that Algerians also didn't want the British and the Italians and other also colonized states did not want a form of neo-colonialism to come in under the guise of free movement, right? So it was just a very interesting moment in which you could finally see how these questions of free movement and mobility weren't always framed in the lexicon and the grammar that we have today, but from a very different perspective. Rambling side note, but yeah.
We have questions.
Sure, great. Let's do it.
But first of all, I would like to give Catherine credit. Catherine is, in fact, Catherine Craven from SOAS and the University of Birmingham. So she introduces herself in the chat. And she asks, did you get your...
Yes.
And then we have another question from Sama Rafiq. And I hope I'm pronouncing Right. How do we move beyond the colonial mode form of new IR research on mobility and migration? I mean,
in a lot of ways, IR in its origin is very colonial.
Yeah.
And a lot of my energy this summer is spent in exploring this, given that I'm based in India. It's very colonial as a field, even within India, I must say, unfortunately.
Right. How do we get beyond? I need to put my mic's on. It's a really big and difficult question, particularly for IR. I'm going to leave IR and its colonial problems aside and try to focus instead on migration studies. I mean, I think I've seen a little bit of wiggle in a few places. I think the Black Lives Matter movement did resonate with a lot of migration studies scholars, and places where I had not expected to see significant change, there has been some change. So, for example, in AMISCO, which is a very European migration studies organization, has been trying to globalize in the last 5 years. But the globalization has largely been to include partners in Canada, Australia, and sort of familiar suspects. And one of the shifts that, like, I've been encouraging this organization, and if anyone from AMISCO is listening out there, to do is to think about, well, look, there's all of these other centers out there that would mean for a more realistic and more generous form of globalization, but it might mean that you have to subsidize some memberships for a few years, and that you might have to subsidize some attendance for scholars who are coming from outside of Europe for a few years at least, in order to be able really to benefit from the knowledge production that's happening in these places, right? And I think it's only going to enrich an organization like that. But I don't know if that gets beyond neo-colonialism. I think that there's a raft of practices. I think Lauren is really the one who's done the most, in my mind, along with others, to really think through these issues. And so I recommend his article. I think there's so many simple things. Like, every university should have a visa and immigration specialist for conferences.
Yeah.
Like, for fuck's sake. Like, I mean, sorry, like, we just held a conference. It was called Delegitimizing Global Migration Control last week. It was lovely. It was in person. And the 4 people who couldn't attend were the junior scholars from the Global South who we wanted to fund to come for their professional development, to have an opportunity to get a PhD. And, like, I mean, this is just not a familiar story, not an unfamiliar story for anyone in any field. But migration studies, I mean, come on, this is our bread and butter. We should be able to be better at that. So, I mean, we could sit down and we should, like, list it all, and we should go to our CVBs and our VCEs and say, this is what we need, because if we're serious about it, and I don't know yet who's on the team or not, but like that, I don't think that many of the changes are actually. I think there are lots of low-hanging fruit, basically, that you could choose, or things like that to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll never forget organizing one of our first workshops, and he was, and Summer says, and you said to me, Frank, like, get the visa process started now. And I thought, okay, yeah, and it was true. And in the end, we ended up having to, one scholar from Algeria and one from Benin, and they Zoomed in to do their papers because this process took months and months and months. And yeah, but that's just one example. Are there questions in the room?
I'm just wondering, your health and the migration studies, is that considered problematic, or, and if it is considered problematic, what is the alternative?
Do you have any answers for me? I mean, I do use the term. I do understand that it's problematic.
I'm struggling with the same problem. That's why.
Yeah, I mean, we've been through various bouts of this, developing countries, third world, global south all of them come with a lot of baggage, and all of them refer to our efforts to really broad brushstroke what should be a far more complicated and nuanced set of discussions, right? I am of the opinion that sometimes broad brushstrokes are needed, but it's worth emphasizing that if we did have a really truly level intellectual playing field, it would be much harder to do that, I think. Like, I think, for example, go onto the ACMS website, and I think there will be other migration centers around that you can do this. I mean, there's a corpus of knowledge there, right? It's just that no one's ever presented it as the like Johannesburg School of, right? Maybe they should, maybe just not that arrogant. But there are, I think that the reason why those sorts of broad brushstrokes can be used is partly because they're being used as political devices, and at least at the intellectual level, there hasn't been the efforts to, and you're seeing it in decolonial thinking at the moment, where there is this really clear, there's a difference between the Indians and the Latin Americans, right? And there are debates that we have drawn out, and now we're, I think, a level of theoretical sophistication that you just can't use post-colonial and decolonial interchangeably anymore, right? And I think that's where I feel like it comes with appreciation first of complexity, diversity, and contribution, and then secondarily, then people will go, "What are you talking about, Global South? There's this tradition, and this tradition, and we can really speak of that because we've listened a little bit more and we've been paying attention to how we incorporate those different strands of knowledge into our field." It's a bit of a dodge, but that's...
No, I struggle with that as well, because there are obviously differences between Latin America, Asia, Africa, and then within, And then what I would then say is, colonialism in a way created that reality,
sure,
and was also given political weight in the 60s at the height of decolonization. So, not using the term also feels incorrect. I don't know. Does that make sense? Reasoning?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit oblique on these sorts of things, if I can say that, in that I really don't think the terms that I use matter that much politically, because I don't have political power and authority. I think there is a reason to be cautious, particularly when we're doing published work, in how we use terminology, and to call up ourselves to be precise in how we use terms. But I've never been the one to tie myself in knots on those sorts of terminological questions and issues, in that I think, for better or worse, the political divide that I'm talking about, and the geopolitical divide, does begin at kind of the Mediterranean, right? And so there is value in thinking about North and South. Is there a better term? If there is, I'm open. I'm willing to shift.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to try to somehow construct the question in a way that makes sense.
Great.
Without me blabbering on. So kind of like who's dying where, but are we looking at the dynamics behind why people are dying? If that makes sense.
No, and it's all not all roses and daisies in conflict studies, right? Like it's and or peace and harmony in conflict studies, right? And what I was trying to do is say that, you know. Okay, so it's I'll try and paraphrase, but how do we avoid doing research that is purely focused on our backyard, like in Europe and North America, and move in the direction of studying other contexts and other forms of politics without also continually being neo-colonial. Yeah, and I was just basically saying I don't have the full answer, but I would argue. I mean, I think the Komarovs have a version of the answer, right? In their work theory from the South, and that is to say that the first step is to stop pretending that emergent contemporary and global phenomena originate in Europe always, right? Like that neoliberalism was not invented in New York. And then just sort of like came out and like spread across the world, that, you know, many of its like most pronounced first iterations and manifestations were in sub-Saharan Africa in the context of World Bank programs, right? Things like that. So that we need to, you know, first of all, disabuse ourselves of that myth, and then really deploy methods that involve, you know, anthropologists, I think, have this essentially right, like not everything right, but to deploy methods that give voices to and allow for conceptual vocabularies to emerge from the field sites that we study, right? That don't always begin with imposition. Where is the state? Well, it doesn't really apply. Like, you know, how can we think about, you know, politics, migration from what they would say is an emic perspective? And I think that route has been extremely fruitful. It just runs up against, like, I mean, work like Golani's, you know, in the Limpopo River, it runs up against this really ingrained tendency, particularly in migration studies, to say, what can we possibly learn from that in places like Europe and North America, when they've been learning from it all along, right? Like this whole tradition of studying like this. So I'm getting into like internal political science language here, but like this sort of street level bureaucracy version of studying states in Europe, which is now all the rage. Everyone wants to do it. That all started in India and sub-Saharan Africa. People like Veena Das and, doing this sort of work, but they never get the credit for it. It's always like, and Michael Lipsky once said this, and therefore we listen to that. So, yeah, it's about being respectful of both the intellectual genealogies and adopting the sort of research methods that allow for grounded theory. And I think that is inherently possible. And even if you are, I think, studying a European context, there's no reason why you can't do that in a genuinely post-colonial, decolonial way, right? And I think like by acknowledging the contributions of scholarship from outside, from elsewhere, and from different contexts, that's how you do it. And I think there is work like that happening at the moment. Like I think there are lots of good stories out there. I'm just giving you the bad version today.
We have two more questions, actually. Michela Coletta, I'm not sure whether it's Michelle or Michaela, but Michela, hi, thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering whether the idea of migration as reparations is also articulated in relation to climate and environmental crises. And as for the idea of reparations in the context of migration, how do we reconcile that with extractive labor patterns associated with migration, especially though not only in the global north? Thank you, Michela Coletta from University of Warwick. And then I will pose the second one at the same time, and we'll evaluate where we are for time when we get to the end of that. That might be the last question. And then Ida Varman says, great talk. Thanks a lot. You mentioned Pourheim de Haas and how migration studies haven't been able to inform and shape contemporary migration and development policies. But what political role can migration studies then have, if any? So do you need me to repeat or summarize, or are you good?
Thank you both of those questions. I'll deal with the first question first, and like Hein and I will disagree on this, but I mean, I think we have proceeded under this premise that the fundamental criteria of relevance is policy relevance, and that's bullshit, right? I mean, sorry, but like there is so much work that goes on in speaking to and animating, you know, both. I mean, the first step is obviously why not speak to activists? Like, why not?
Yes.
That is a parallel, you know, way in which. Thank you, Rachel. In which, you know, that is relevance to me. My colleague Barak Kalia has like this devastating critique on, you know, this contemporary state of social movements on migration. So I mean, I acknowledge all the limitations, but that's like a first step. And I mean, the second step is to say that, that one of the things that migration studies, I think, is waking up to now is that the voices and the experiences that we have been least capable of adequately humanizing and recognizing are migrants, right? After talking to and observing for 35 years or so migrant behaviors, we don't get them. And I recently was like completely floored by a paper by a colleague called Anja Frank, who's from Sweden, who wrote a paper who's doing excellent work on humor and migration. And her basic take is that we have yet to see how migrants laugh at borders, right? And we have yet to really pay attention to the political power and agentic nature of the way in which migrants see the stupidity in all of these forms of power and elaborate mechanisms that we have invented to try and control their existence and debase their humanity. And she's like really keen to rescue some of that, right? But she's a real outlier, I think, in trying to really, you know, that's the sort of migration studies work that I really think has value, that can, you know, move beyond this victimhood sort of narrative that we are so committed to. You know, that those are criteria of relevance that should matter much more in our work. So those are like a couple of like early forays into that. And I think it's okay. I mean, everyone has to play the game of policy relevance, but it's a game, right? And I think I don't think it's intellectually disingenuous to take Horizon 2020 money and use it for something else. Like, sorry. I'm going to get killed for that.
We're not recording.
We're not recording. Fantastic. Let's say whatever. Right, we can. I'm fine. I'm not going to get Horizon 2020 money anyway. The first question is much harder, much more difficult to really engage with, because I mean, I do unfortunately think that the climate refugee concept is already a non-starter, right? Like that I think, so this is a PhD student, her name's Sophie Shriver, she's doing excellent work on this, but there's been this unholy alliance between climate science and conservative migration and refugee research / policy on the concept of adaptation, right? Like that's already, there's not going to be a climate refugee norm anytime soon, nor there's not the stomach for it globally, that the entire way, unless there's some sort of major shift that's coming down the road. But like, I just, based on what I've seen in Sophie's work, and it's way more sophisticated than I can present, that adaptation is the winner, right? That basically what's going to be, first of all, most of the migration that's directly attributed to climate change will be internal and therefore not necessarily spark the forms of migration responses and politicization as we might expect. But then I think it's mostly going to be about how states adapt, provide camps and temporary humanitarian solutions, but nothing like neo-refoulement. Like the only thing that gave me hope was that recent case, and I forget what it was, a case in front of the European Human Rights Council. I'm getting it wrong, I no doubt, in which finally we had this case of someone who really could not return home because home was underwater. And what do we do about that? Like, what is the politics of addressing that situation? And the Human Rights Council sort of limply navigated their way through it, but I think they first maybe enunciated what this principle would look like. I'm sure it's proceeded further since then. Was there more to that? There was a second side to that question, which I don't think I've addressed.
I've only got about 6 minutes left, and I actually think the last question I have here from Eva might be a really nice close up. Suspended my own question, which is how can you use fiction in migration studies to give voice to the unvoiced?
I would do
that. But actually, Eva has a wonderful question, and then of course you will answer the burger question as well. But Eva says, how do you reconcile your awareness of the complicity of your field with some of these questionable policies or some of the flaws that you've just outlined to us? How do you reconcile this awareness with your own role in the institution as somebody with a career in migration research supporting the constellation? And implied is, do you have guidance for young scholars who are also navigating this? And I think you spoke a little bit about that, but maybe it's a nice final reflection.
Yes, speaking from the position of someone who has screwed up the world immensely for your generation already. It's not on you, it's on us, first of all, to really change the work practices and the institutions of our field. So yes, I mean, I think I moved into an intellectual career where precarity was not really an issue, and young and emerging scholars now face a very different intellectual landscape in which you have to, if I'm in my, this is what you need to do to get hired and actually have a job mode, you have to play certain games and be willing to trust your seniors to provide the pathways that have an ethical basis for you to have a career. So, I mean, this is like a get out of jail free card for emerging scholars. But then I think for us, what do we do? I think we need to stop playing or play the game a lot differently. And I think that we too often have compromised our ethics in order to further our intellectual careers, when I don't think many of those compromises actually need to be made. And I think actually, I mean, if you look really at the European funding landscape, for example, I think there is room for projects that are actually politically and ethically more challenging in places like the ERC, in places like the Swedish Refugee Council, the Swedish Research Council. It's few and far between, but I think there are enough resources out there and fellow travellers that you don't always have to return to this staid language that migration studies has allowed itself to fall into. And I think there's lots of now, people like Tendai, like Lauren, there are many more who are providing the umbrella for this sort of research to not only be considered plausible, but be considered mainstream. and latch onto those, right? Like, I think this is the decolonial moment, and play that tune as strongly as you can, because one side of the field is scared of it and the other is deeply encouraged. And so if that's a good note to end on, I think, like, actually you just gotta be able to insist on it and just say, like, actually, if you're not, if your work is not speaking to Achille Mbembe's work, that's on you, right? And not my problem. So, yeah, I mean, just a few thoughts. And then Rachel, yeah, the burger, yeah. Yes, I had the burger. Of course, I had the burger. But Rachel had, like, a quick question on. I'll just end on it, like, literary contributions.
Yeah, you talk so much about politics and economics and all that. And I'm like, well, the voices of fiction is a place to look for voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone who's read it, like, books like Americana have, like, really reshaped the way in which we think about migration, diaspora, and identity, and there are countless more and others. And I'm trying to do something similar myself. And like, one thing I did in the pandemic was just stop writing journal articles and just start writing and allow a more fictive, creative sensibility, which I felt captured some of the voices in my research and in my life, to speak through a little bit more into my work. I think we can all do that a little bit more. I'm trying, and I've got to end with a plug, but I'm trying with this journal, Migration Politics, to provide a space for people to do that, because I think we're all tired of churning out these 8,000-word pieces that improve our citation metrics. And we're looking for a space in which we can write things with meaning. Yeah, I'm hopeful and looking forward to doing more of that.
That's just a perfect place to end. And so everybody in the room, things with meaning.
And
so much obstacles and progress. And most of all, thank you to Darshan for revealing knowledge to us, unpacking previously known things, and talking all the way up here and fixing your childcare and Uber problems. And just thanks. It's just great. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time. Watch our Twitter feed for the details. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
We did it.
Sorry?
You always make me do that.
What?